And now it's time for our time of meditation. So I invite you to let this be an inner time. If you're comfortable with this, you might even close your eyes. And once again, let this be a time to commune with Spirit. So, perhaps begin simply by taking a deep breath and letting it go. As we remind ourselves that we are still the divine beings that God created. I remind myself that I am a divine expression of all that God is. Divine love, divine power of creation, divine wisdom, and divine aliveness. So take a moment and let yourself feel how it feels to be an expression of divine love. How does that feel? Because that is the truth, the deepest truth of your being. How does it feel to be an expression of the divine power of creation? Because that is the deepest truth of your being. So let yourself feel how powerful you are. And let yourself feel how it feels to know that you are always able to access divine wisdom. And so let yourself feel like a channel of spirit, allowing divine wisdom to simply flow through you. And that you are an expression of divine aliveness. Let yourself feel that aliveness. And then take a moment after feeling all that to invite your older brother Jesus right into your consciousness, our way shower. In fact, see him standing right in front of you. And see him saying, "You are my beloved son or daughter, in whom I am well pleased." Excuse me, you are my divine sister or brother, in whom I am well pleased. And then take a moment and ask this inner teacher if he has anything that he would say to you about the truth of your being for a moment in the silence. And then for however much you have been able to feel that deepest truth of your being, just know that that's a preview of coming attractions, a preview of how you will feel all the time someday. And give thanks to Spirit for showing it to you in whatever form you did, that Spirit did today. So thank you, God. Amen.
Always a little bit difficult following meditation. This has been on my mind all week. It just keeps on coming to me, so I figured it should be sung today. Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. In my hour of darkness, she is standing right in front of me. Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be. Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. People living in this world agree there will be an answer, let it be. Though they may be parted, there is still a chance they will see. There will be an answer, let it be. Let it be, let it be. There will be there is still a light that shines on me, shining till tomorrow. Let it be. Wake up to the sound of music. Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom. Let it be. Let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom. Let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be, let it be, let it be.
Thank you, that was beautiful. I was saying to someone earlier that every time I come here, I'm always impressed by this place. I think that those of you who have been a part of creating this, turning this into a spiritual center from, what did it used to be? From a medical center, you just did a fabulous job. It is such a nice layout and it has such a great feeling, so thank you so much for all that you did in creating this. It is a good day to be named Phil. As many of you know, Groundhog Day stars Punxsutawney Phil. So happy Groundhog Day. Happy Palindrome Day, as the usher at the door told me, 02022020. And happy Super Bowl Sunday. One day, in a small town, a radio station wanted to interview a woman who was 80 years old and had just gotten married for the 4th time. So they sent one of their people, and this fellow asked her about her life and how it felt to be married at the age of 80 for the 4th time, and then asked, "What does your husband do for a living? Your new husband?" She said, he's a funeral director. The man said, the interviewer said, "Well, that's an interesting choice. And by any chance, would you let me know what your previous husbands did?" She got a smile on her face and she said, "Well, in my 20s, I married a banker. In my early 40s, I married a circus ringmaster. And in my 60s, I married a minister." The interviewer said, "Well, that's a series of amazing choices. Is there any rhyme or reason to it?" She said, "Well, I married one for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and there you go." My title of my lesson, my message this morning is Loving, Empowering Relationships, and this woman wanted to practice a lot, which is great. I was reading a book recently by Lynn McTaggart called The Bond. And in that book, she says that there's research that shows that loneliness is a leading cause of heart illness. Some of us in Unity, metaphysically minded, might say, you know, the #1 cause of death in this country is dying from a broken heart. In that book also, she says, other research has shown that if right now you belong to no group at all, and then join just one group, your risk of dying from any disease this next year is cut in half. So good for you for being part of this. So in other words, all relationships are good. But here at Unity, we have an opportunity to go beyond the kind of relationships we so often see in the world. Often we describe those relationships as codependent or even dysfunctional. And here we have a chance to practice relationships in which we empower each other. My ministry, for at least the past 35 years, has been all about personal transformation. Transforming ourselves from a false sense of ourselves, which I call our ego mind, using it in the same way A Course in Miracles does, which means our ego is who we believe we are when we feel separate from God and separate from each other. It's a life based on fear. So from that ego mind, transforming ourselves into our true divine selves, which we in Unity call Christ consciousness. And as I said earlier, that means knowing ourselves as divine love, divine power of creation, divine wisdom, and divine aliveness. And the most powerful tool for transforming our lives is our relationships. I love what Marianne Williamson said in her wonderful book, A Return to Love, when she said, you know what the secret is to spiritual growth? The secret is other people. I couldn't agree more. It's one thing to believe that we're growing when we're by ourselves, but it's another thing to practice that spiritual growth when we're with other people. A Course in Miracles says that the purpose of all relationships is to support us in healing what Emily Cady, in her book Lessons in Truth, calls our sense of separation from God. And the reason she says it's a sense of separation from God is because we can't actually be separate from God. But when we're in our ego mind, it can certainly feel that way. And I say that the second purpose of relationships is to empower each other to be all that we came here to be. Empowering relationships begin with knowing that we are two whole beings coming together, joining together. In my marriage to my wife Laura, we've now been married 35 years, and we do our very best to know that we are both whole beings. And we do our very best to know that our job in marriage is to empower each other. This is my second marriage. In my first marriage, I believed that we were two half people who, when we got together, made a whole person. You know what? That's not true. Two halves in relationships don't make a whole. This belief is the ego's viewpoint in relationships, of relationships. It begins with us believing that there's something missing in me. It begins with us believing that I am missing some pieces and I'm incomplete. Anybody ever had that thought? Of course. And this train of thought continues by saying we need to find that one special person out there who can provide what we believe is missing in us. Ken Wapnick, who is a spokesperson for A Course in Miracles, says those kind of relationships are, to the ego, ones that are made in heaven. Not exactly so. Did anybody ever see the movie a long time ago, Jerry Maguire? Yeah. Well, there's this famous quote in that movie when he says, "You complete me." When I saw that, I thought, oh no, how sad. Because in those kind of relationships, there are some huge problems. The problems in those kind of relationships begin with the fact that in them there is no room for partners to change and grow. It would be too threatening to the relationship. Another problem is that if one partner gives too much time or attention to other people or other interests, it brings up jealousy in the relationship. Because after all, the other person is my source. So I'm going to feel pretty jealous if they start giving more time or attention to someone or something else. But the biggest problem in those relationships is if I believe I'm missing something that you have, every time I look at you, I'm reminded of what I believe I'm missing. And unconsciously, I hate you for it. That's not fun. So how about a big breath after that? That can get pretty heavy, can't it? This is so different from relationships that begin with us knowing that we are two whole beings who aren't together out of need, but rather we're together for the joy of loving and empowering each other. My wife Laura empowers me all the time. Sometimes when I don't think I want to be empowered. Anybody ever been there? The time that I remember as the biggest one that I can think of in my marriage is when I was in the process of writing my book, Real Wealth. I can't tell you the number of times I wanted to quit. I can't do this, I would say. And she would say, yes, you can. And you are doing it, so just keep putting one foot in front of the other, or one key typing in front of the other, and keep going. And I'm so glad she did. And I do the same for her whenever I can. About 10 years ago, she wanted to go back to graduate school. She wanted to go back to school. She wanted to go to graduate school. And she was afraid to do so. In her childhood, she had been taught, in those years where we are hypnotizable, she had been taught to believe that she was stupid because she was dyslexic. And back in those days, there was no diagnosis like that. And I get to remind her regularly, she's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And the other thing she thought was, I'm too old to go back to school. But she wanted to go back to school. And I am so glad that I continued to support her in doing that. She got her master's degree in counseling psychology with an emphasis on art therapy. And right now she's doing a fabulous job as a therapist. I have also been blessed in my life to have other people along the way who empowered me, who saw more in me than I saw in myself. And I bet that if you look back, you can say the same thing. Two of the people in my life who empowered me, who saw more in me than I saw in myself, were my first two Unity ministers, Hal and Flo Dibley. This was back in 1972. Some of us are a little ancient here. And it was a time when there was only one Unity Center in Minneapolis, and that was in North Minneapolis. Excuse me, in the Twin Cities area, and that was in North Minneapolis. And I met them, I fell in love with Unity, but I did not see myself as a Unity minister. Fortunately, they did. And they kept supporting me in going in this direction. Well, I believed them enough to apply to Unity's ministerial school. I got accepted, and as I was driving from here to Kansas City to start ministerial school, moving there, I remember having the thought, I hope there's a course of study that I can take in becoming a Unity minister where all I do is be a counseling minister, because I was terrified of public speaking. I'm so glad that they saw through that and saw me for who I am. There was another guy that reminded me, I was reminded of as I was preparing this message this morning. A guy in Hawaii named Paul Cutright, who was teaching a 6-month-long course in deep transformation at the time. I wanted to take that course. It cost $5,000. And I remember thinking to myself, first of all, I had a lot of judgments about him for being a spiritual teacher and charging for it, but that's a whole other story. But I remember saying to Paul, what do you say when people find out it's $5,000 and they tell you, I can't afford to do that? Paul said, well, I tell you what, Phil, as a spiritual teacher, I think that my job, if someone says, I want to do something, and then they try to tell me why they can't do it, I think my job is not to believe them. Well, fortunately, in my case, he didn't believe me, because I said that to him. I can't afford that course. And he said to me, Phil, you are a powerful manifester, but you hold yourself back like crazy. Well, I got so much out of that 6-month course that I went on to take more of that training. But as much as I got out of that 6-month course, there wasn't anything bigger than creating $5,000 for the tuition when I thought that there was no way in the world that I could do it. I thought to myself, if I can do this, I can do anything. And during that training, every time I would try to argue for my limitations, Paul would say, Phil, right now I'm more on your side than you are. And he was right. 4 years later, I took this 4-year-long course in learning how to teach that program, and it became the basis for Theophilus Divinity School, which Laura and I led here in Minneapolis for 13 years. And I'm so glad that I had people in my life who didn't believe my small ideas about myself. As I said, the Holy Spirit's purpose for all relationships is supporting us in healing our sense of separation from God and empowering us to be all that we want to be. So, how do we have loving, empowering relationships? It begins with us accepting there's nothing missing in me. I'm going to say that one more time, and then I'm going to ask you to join with me in saying it aloud as an affirmation. So, there's nothing missing in me. Together? There's nothing missing in me. I hope you can feel the truth of that, because it is the truth. And I hope you can feel the truth of this too. I'm going to ask you to say this one with me as well. I am already whole and complete. Together? I am already whole and complete. This how-to continues with our willingness to accept that everyone else is also whole and complete. So take a moment to think of someone in your life, someone that maybe you haven't had that thought about. But whoever it is, someone in your life, and I'm going to invite you to say, thinking of that person, we aren't here to save each other. Together? We aren't here to save each other. We're here to empower each other. Together? We're here to empower each other. These empowering relationships begin with that kind of spiritual vision, seeing through the appearance of who we have been to who we have been so far, I should say, to the truth of our divinity. At one point, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" One of the disciples said, "Well, some of them say you're Elijah." Another one said, "Well, some of them say you're one of the prophets." And then Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And of course, Peter, always the outspoken one, said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to Peter, "Peter, flesh and blood, that is, physical sight, flesh and blood did not reveal that to you, but my Father in heaven." That is to say, it wasn't what you have seen me do so far that revealed that to you. It was seeing me with spiritual vision. When we only see each other as what we've been and done, that's flesh and blood defining our identity. When we see each other with spiritual vision, that's revealing our true divine self. Or in other words, that's revealing our Christ self. And that is the basis of loving, empowering relationships. These loving and empowering relationships are where all the fun and true joy are. So I invite you today to commit to being a true friend and having true friendships, which of course is the basis for all marriages that work. Being on the side of each other's true divine identity instead of being on the side of seeing their incompleteness. We are always teaching ourselves and others by our actions what we believe to be the truth of our being. So let this week be a time to teach yourself and everyone in your life the divine truth. We are already whole. Would you say that one more time? We are already whole. You deserve to know the joy of practicing loving and empowering relationships and having them be a way of life. Namaste.
Namaste.